All right, so we left off on connective tissue, and we have 8 more tissues to learn. And so let's jump to the connective tissue portion. And as a reminder, try to remember that all epithelial tissue is considered a surface tissue and has a membrane underneath, and then it's followed by connective tissue. And so let's get to the connective tissue part. Right here. All right, so some things that we have to sort of think about is that we saw that we had, or an organization to epithelial cells, that they were always arranged very tightly, again, like tiles. And so it's like, one cell after another. These are supposed to be numbers. I know I'm writing a little funky right now. Let me put this somewhere comfortable. And they were very close together, but that is not going to be the case for connective tissue. For connective tissue, it's better to think about them in terms of like spiders instead. Like they all have, here's a cell, here's a cell, here's a cell. And what do spiders always give out? Like a web, right? Exactly, a web. And so you can think about it like this, that each individual cell will produce substances around it. It's going to secrete substances, and they sort of are in this wild, like, organization. They're not necessarily perfectly organized, and they're pushing each other away as they secrete substances, and then they create a texture, a material, a whole tissue, because they secrete very specific things together, but they are not completely attached together, as we saw with epithelial cells, where they, again, are always going to be next to each other. And so that's what this first note is about. It's about, they're characterized by scattered cells. Scattered cells. And I mentioned that they have secretions. Again, like spiders produce spider webs, these cells in particular will produce particular substances, and it really depends on what tissue we're talking about. So we can just summarize, or just put an umbrella term around it, that they secrete something into their matrix. Matrix. This word matrix is just like when we learned extracellular matrix. This is a fancy word to mean area, a plane of space, an area, that's it. And so in our anatomy class, whenever you hear the word matrix, we are talking about the space around. And so you can see that this word isn't that complex when we really just think about the matrix outside the cells. It just means the area outside the cells. And so what do they secrete? Proteins. We learned in lecture that proteins are created by ribosomes. They go to the rough ER, they go to the Golgi body or apparatus, and then they're going to secrete out through the plasma membrane, or just go straight to the plasma membrane. And some of those substances that these cells give off are more than likely going to be proteins. And we refer to those proteins as fibers. Because again, connective tissue is a structural component. Remember that proteins can either be molecular machines, which we named either enzymes, or they can be, again, part of the cytoskeleton or a structural component. And so we're going to see now that they can also secrete proteins, which will just serve to create a whole texture or a material. I'm just going to try to keep it simple right now, but otherwise they create a structural protein. And we'll see examples of that in a second. And some of them are so different. For example, one that you already know, believe it or not, you already have a tissue in your brain, is bone. Bone itself is a completely solid tissue. And if the blood that you would see coming out of somebody that had an injury, that blood, the red stuff in movies, that's also connective tissue. So technically you know 2 connective tissues already. But you can see that they have absolutely zero, what's the word I'm looking for? Zero similarity. They're nothing alike. Bone and blood are absolutely nothing alike. So connective tissue is going to be hard to connect with the other, and the names become a little bit tough because of that very reason. But solid and liquid and semi-solid tends to be how we can characterize these connective tissues. And do not forget, they can always be found underneath the epithelial tissues. They are never on the surface of things. And so this becomes our first tissue. This is going to be areolar loose connective tissue. And we can see here on this individual picture, we have to be able to address, just like last time, we weren't sure what we were looking at. And so this is going to be are nuclei. You can see the cell is here. You can't really see the entire body of the cell like you were able to see in epithelial tissues. But when we stain these tissues, you'll notice that their nuclei will always be purple. So every single purple dot you're seeing in here is a stained nucleus. And you can see that it's not really marking the rest of the cell. Right, this is the nucleus, and don't forget the nucleus is just the center. There should be like the rest of the cell. There should be the Golgi body. There should be a rough ER around the nucleus and a smooth ER and all those mitochondria. So every single one of these little individuals here are a complete cell that have all those organelles we learned about in lecture. And now you can see they're not organized next to each other, like back to back. And this particular type of tissue is considered a loose connective tissue. You'll notice that in this microscope picture, this is blank space. There's nothing here. This is like if you were just looking at strings together. And this is what I mean by proteins that they secrete. They secrete these hair-like structures here, these hair-like proteins, and these are the protein fibers that we were talking about in the very beginning. So something we're going to add to this note here is they secrete elastic, collagen. This is going to be a familiar one for some of us, so collagen. And then also reticular. And that's what makes this difficult and easy, that these are the three proteins that we care about in this chapter. These are the three proteins that we're going to see in all of these particular connective tissues, and we're going to see just some unique combination of it, and that's what makes each one different. So here, these thin hair-like ones are going to be elastic fibers. They look like exactly like that, like hair strands, dark hair strands. We then have collagen fibers, which are going to be these deeper pink ones here that we're seeing. All the pink ones, even these in the back here, these pink ones, and it's just not as thick as the one above. And so these are going to be what these cells secrete, and they create this unique texture. And where do we encounter it? This is epithelial tissue, but what is on the basal side of epithelial tissue? Connective tissue, but what's in between those two? The basement membrane. Now you know what that basement membrane is made out of. It's made out of areolar connective tissue. So in all these tissues that you learned about previously, let's find it clear, this one. This basement membrane is typically where we find areolar tissue. And at times, this is also where we find it. This is a very unique instance and maybe a little bit more complicated than I wanted it to be. But when you look at this, you'll notice that all of these cells here were epithelial cells when we were looking at stratified squamous. All of these cells are tightly bound together. There's like no space between them. And then once we go past this basement membrane is made out of areolar tissue, but so can a layer down here. It can also be areolar tissue. And so this is a great picture so you can see the difference between the organization. You can see these nuclei are not arranged back to back or next to each other like those stratified squamous, but this is an example of areolar tissue as well that you're seeing right here. You can see they're not organized next to each other, and they secrete substances around each other, pushing each other around according to their secretions. And so you can see right back to back the different levels of organization that you see in areolar tissue. And so this tissue is particularly known for just packaging things. Sometimes you're always going to see it called like packaging peanuts. You've seen when you get like an important package in the mail, that it comes with a little foam pebbles, foam peanuts that go and protect whatever it is that you ordered. And so it's like stuffing in a way. And so it's like packaged peanuts. Tends to be like what it's expressed to students. And the reason being is that because its role is to allow a bunch of wandering cells to wander through. For example, you have white blood cells that would be going and navigating through these empty spaces, making sure that if you were to get some sort of nick or some sort of damage on the skin, that if a pathogen goes into this very important layer, you have white blood cells that are going to be defending you in that space. And so this tissue sort of is just a space. It serves to cushion and again allows for cells to just migrate through it. And so that's what this note is about. Wraps and cushions organs. And then also it allows for macrophages to phagocytize bacteria. In other words, it allows for white blood cells, we're going to keep it light, white blood cells, to eat bacteria, This word comes up in lecture today, but to eat bacteria, to eat bacteria. And that's really it. That's the role of this tissue. Now, the cells have a name. These cells are not just called cells. If you notice, we haven't heard the word cuboidal cell. We haven't heard the word squamous cell. We haven't heard the word columnar cell. And those words do not exist with connective tissue. Each individual cell is called a fibroblast, And you can even use this word interchangeably with fibrocyte. What did the word cyte mean in Latin? Cell. And so this is like saying a fiber cell. And doesn't that make sense? It produces elastic fibers, collagen fibers. So this cell's role is to produce fibers. And so for now, you can just simply call a fibroblast or fibrocyte. The difference is that fibroblasts tend to make the fibers, fibrocytes maintain the fibers. This is like a naive or an immature version of this one. So a fibroblast will eventually become a fibrocyte when it matures. But the word blast usually means that it makes something, it builds. Let that remind you of that. It'll be more relevant for next week as well. And so this tissue, again, what this is trying to show you here is that there's a nuclei, and I personally am pretty certain that the entire nuclei is actually what's stained, and we're not seeing the entire cell. And I'll have to double check that, but otherwise just keep in mind all these purple dots will represent a cell when it goes in our class. But this notes here are trying to show you that, oh, okay, this whole thing is the cell, and then the nuclei would be somewhere inside. But for us, all you need to know is that this is an individual cell, and each one is called a fibrocyte or a fibroblast. You wouldn't be able to tell just from the picture which one's which. And so these are two pictures of the exact same thing. Remember that the thin purple ones, the thin hair-like ones will always be elastic, and then the pink one will always be collagen. Even on a fuzzy image like this, the elastic ones are pretty clear, but the collagen is these pink ones that are in that backdrop, in the background. They're sort of scattered behind. And do not worry. On the exam, they tend to use a clear picture like this or one like this. They don't really do something like this to you guys. And so let's do the first one, so get the spirit of it. Here, when we look at the cell type, in this case, it's not squamous, it's not cuboidal, it's not columnar. We are talking about fibroblast. And so when a bunch of fibroblasts, or again, fibrocytes, when they come together and produce collagen and elastic fibers, they create areolar connective tissue. They create the whole tissue. You'll notice that we don't call it areolar cell, it's fibrocyte. These fibrocytes all together make up the entire tissue. When we look at connective tissues, we don't really just care about the cells, we care about the cells and everything that they produce around them. And then the entire thing is still classified as the tissue, and every individual is a cell. And so number 2, structure, it's not in color, but the large pink one here that we're seeing is more than likely, the larger one is always going to be collagen. And number 3, the thin hair-like one is going to be elastic. And then the tissue that it represents is going to be areolar, just the name above. Make sure you practice spelling for that one. And then a location, you can just simply write basement membrane, or around cushioning every organ. Pick one that's really easy for you to remember. I'm going to put basement membrane. I'm going to put surrounding organs. And leave it at that, surrounding organs. And so, next tissue, adipose. This is what we famously know as fat tissue. This is the fat in our bodies. This is that tissue that makes it up. And this fat tissue, or these particular types of tissue, are a little bit different and a little hard to even separate from areolar connective tissue, because right now what you need to draw your eyes to for adipose is that every single one of these globes is the actual cell itself. So if we look at this one, these two are the clearest ones. Here, this is going to be the entire cell. And this is going to be the nuclei of the cell. All of this, you'll notice, is nothing but a huge storage vacuole. I'm going to write vacuole. Inside the cell. And so what these cells specialize in is creating and parting a space for fat cells and for fat molecules. We learned about lipids. They're stored in fat. That's why lipids and fat molecules tend to share the same word, because fat, or what's in here, are lipids. It is storing lipids for the body. Lipids not only serve as a plasma membrane component, but they also serve to actually provide the body with energy when it needs it. And with that, we all already know the function of fat. It's to, again, hold on to some reserve food fuel. It also insulates the body. This tissue helps protect you from getting cold too easily. And then it also supports and protects organs, sort of like a cushion. You only need to know one function. One will keep you safe. And so one last thing to add about this, and this is one of the most frustrating ones to teach, because, or like really learn in higher levels, because adipose, you really can't tell the difference between adipose sometimes and areolar. If anything, you find these two tissues together. Even in this space here, the space in between, this is more than likely areolar tissue. And so wherever you find areolar tissue, again, it's like a packaging. You'll see that it's like in between these cells, sort of packaging between all of these cells. Again, all these spaces. But again, the ones we care about right now are going to be those globe-like cells. And these cells have the name adipocytes. And let's, I'm not seeing it in this page. And here's our word, adipocytes. And so this is the term to describe every single one of these cells. All together they make fat tissue or adipose tissue, but the cells, just one of them, are called adipocyte. Adipocyte. The structure on the inside is called a vacuole, a fat vacuole. And it stores fat molecules. That little storage container inside of those cells takes up the entire space inside, so they don't really have a lot of space for more cytoplasm. And I guess this isn't really something you need to highlight, but just as a fact to understand. And that's it. So for the exam, the only thing that they'll probably do is ask you name or ID the cell. If they ask you to ID the cell, you are answering adipocyte. But if they say ID the tissue, what are you answering? Adipose. That's a clear distinction. It would be wrong if you wrote the tissue as adipocyte. The name of the tissue is adipose, and the name of the cell is adipocyte. All right. And that's really another, this is another picture that you'll see for it. All right, nothing different, just another picture. And I'll let you all practice this, and we'll go over the answer to these tomorrow, and we'll do epithelials in a second after this. All right, our next tissue. Remember that first tissue was called areolar tissue. Its role was to be a loose tissue. It needed to be loose because it allows all those cells to navigate through it like a net. That's really the best way to think about this tissue, or the one that we just saw first. is that it really is supposed to serve as sort of a net, not really this perfectly tight sealed material. It's supposed to allow for cells to be able to navigate through here. And so they tend to be in a category called loose tissue. And as opposed to this tissue, this one's going to be called dense. And you'll notice if we even just compare the photo that we don't really see a lot of empty spaces. We can see like a little bit here, but if we were to compare to that first tissue, we really don't see the same level or the same amount of open spaces. And that's because this tissue has an important role to keep your bones together. It makes up your ligaments. And it also makes up your tendons. Now, what is the difference between a ligament and a tendon? A ligament holds bone to bone, and the other one, our other tissue, holds our muscles to our bone, holds muscle to bone. And that's the difference between ligaments and tendons. Otherwise, they're made out of the same material. But again, one holds bone to bone, tendons hold muscle to bone. And they are made out of dense, regular connective tissue. Now, this is here to sort of help you remember a very useful fact, is that you kind of already learned everything that you need to know about this tissue. The large pink fibers in that other one were called collagen fibers, and you'll notice this one is primarily made out of collagen fibers. That's it. That's what pink is always usually stained as, collagen fibers. And I have even better news. These cells, this is the entire cell that you're seeing here, and they are also called fibroblast and fibrocytes. So just learning these two, learning the name is tough, but once you learn dense regular and you learn areolar tissue, once you learn those two, you really have learned everything you need to know, because the cells that make them are also called fibroblasts. But there's just a small fundamental difference is just like the way we describe the cells are different. Like when we talk about cells like feline or the word feline, when I say the word feline, feline can encompass cougars, can encompass tigers, lions, house cats, lynxes, bobcats, right? We all just know that feline includes some sort of cat-like animal. And the word fibroblast is a generic word to mean a cell that produces fibers. And so this one would be called, again, a fibroblast. It's a generic word for the cells that produce these fibers, like feline. And so that makes it a little bit easier on students because, you kind of just learn fibroblasts and you pretty much learn them all. And so, again, fibroblast is going to be the one that builds. Fibrocytes is going to be a mature version of it, a mature version of fibroblasts. But otherwise, for our sake, you can just learn them as every single one of those cells are either fibroblasts or fibrocytes. Nothing new to add. And now I'm seeing the word matrix again. I'm going to apply it now that we see 3 different types of matrices. That the word matrix in this context is that this is our cell, and then this space outside is its matrix. That's it. So you can see that if we were using the word matrix, they are all sharing the same matrix. They are all secreting protein fibers, like collagen, out into the matrix. And so that's how you would use that word, matrix. If we apply it to the last one, you'll see that the matrix is not very thin. There's not really a lot of matrix because these cells are so tight to get together. They're just bound together so tightly, these adipose cells. And then if we see our first tissue, every single one of these cells, the matrix, again, is the area around. So they have a loose matrix, and they share a matrix together. They share the area around each other. All right. And let's keep it going. I'll bring up some useful facts after this. The next one, we are familiar with blood. Blood is a fluid connective tissue. It is the only fluid connective tissue that we have. And we already know the role of blood. we know that its role is to carry around oxygen molecules for the body. It picks them up at the lungs and will deliver it to the rest of the body. And it travels through the blood vessels. So a location is in blood vessels, nice and easy. Now, its its matrix, right? This here is a red blood cell. Red blood cell. We're going to have to make that distinction. You'll notice up here we see red and white blood cells. And these little red ones, the smaller ones, are going to be our red blood cells, all of these here. These large purple ones, I know it's called white blood cells, but when you stain them for the microscope, they actually come out purple. And so all these large ones with very unique nuclei are going to be white blood cells. So you can see two different types here. You don't really care about the names of like neutrophil and lymphocyte. You just need to know that it's a white blood cell. It's in the family of a white blood cell. And always, if you see a nucleus, a nuclei, you are seeing a white blood cell. Because one fun fact about red blood cells is that they do not have a nucleus. They do not have a nucleus. They lose it when they mature. And next, you'll notice that the matrix, we saw in areolar tissue that it was sort of like a loose space in a way for cells to navigate. When you look at this picture, you have to imagine a bowl, like a soup, bowl of soup. And then, every soup comes with a broth, and then it comes with things inside that broth, right? That you can it could be noodles, it could be a meat or a chicken or whatever you're going to put in that soup. But the soup component, the liquid component, is called plasma in this case. Around these cells is a fluid called plasma, as you see it right here. And so the language changes slightly when we talk about it. You'll say, the matrix around it, you would just say more appropriately, the fluid matrix. But this word plasma tends to just be a simpler word for the same thing. The fluid matrix around the cells. Because remember, that blood is a liquid, and so all of these cells are swimming in that liquid called plasma. And so, some technical terms here. Erythrocyte. Erythros, Latin for red. And so you can see erythrocytes mean red blood cells. And again, they do not have a nucleus. And then white blood cells tend to be called leukocytes. I'm not seeing the word, so I'll just write it for you when we get to it. For our exam, since it is the first exam, you can write red blood cells or white blood cells. You don't have to remember the word erythrocytes or leukocytes yet, but just keep in mind it's something to know. Because what do we think leukemia is cancer of what? Of your white blood cells, not blood cells, because you could be red blood cells, right? So white blood cells. Leukemia, again, leuko is Latin for white blood cells, white in general. And with that, all right, next one. Nothing much to add. All right, so the rest of this material takes a kind of a shift. And when you look at these other cells, you'll notice blood. We didn't talk about fibrocytes. We didn't talk about adipocytes. Just red blood cells, white blood cells. They do not exist in that tissue. Now, when you see this word, cartilage, what's the Latin word that we should all be thinking about? Chondro, right. Chondro. Chondro implies that there's going to be some sort of cartilage. And so the only thing that changes now is that the cells look a little different, they organize themselves a little different, and they're also called something different. And they're called chondrocytes. Cartilage cells. Cartilage cells. Chondrocytes. So it would be wrong to write fibrocytes, right? And lacuna, this is plural. Right now the way you're seeing it is plural. And singular would be with just an A. Lacuna. Lacuna. Without the E. Singular. And all it is, it's a little cavity that the cell resides in. Because fibrocytes, you'll notice that they were just out in the open and they're just secreting their substances in their matrix. But these chondrocytes, they're actually trapped inside of these little lacuna. And the way to think about this cell or this tissue is that the tissues that we've discussed previously are essentially a little bit not so solid. And so this is considered a semi-solid tissue. And these cells, as they create all of their substances in their matrix, we'll talk about that in a second, they actually get trapped inside of these little cavities because this material is so tough. I don't know if any of you remember when you eat a chicken leg, there's always that little nasty little yellow dangly thing that nobody eats, right? And it's chewy and kind of gross. And so that's what we're thinking about. We're thinking about that kind of material. It's kind of supposed to be like if I were to grab that little yellow gross thing and I were supposed to twist it, if I let it go, what happens to it? If I let go, it just goes back into its shape. It retains its shape. And so that's what you have to imagine when you think about cartilage, is that its role is to allow for movement or flexibility, but it's supposed to retain its shape. And with that, it's not very fluid. It's not a very liquidy material. So those cells, when they create it, they get stuck inside. And when they get stuck inside, again, of those lacuna. So when you talk about the word chondrocytes, the word that you need to jump to immediately is also lacuna. That's a feature of chondrocytes. And then their matrix, what do they secrete? Collagen. That's it. You already knew that though, right? Collagen is one of the main, strongest structural components. And now that brings me to a very important fact. Is you'll notice that all these cells, they don't do anything unique or that special from each other. They secrete collagen, all of them. They secrete maybe elastic. And that's what makes them different. What makes them different is that when you look at cartilage, that when they make their collagen, they add a little bit of a cartilage salt, special ingredient on top of it. And then it makes collagen, that same fiber that we saw on those other tissues, it makes this tissue tougher just because they add a particular type of salt. And that's I really don't want to get too complex or give a name to that yet, but it's just going to be, that's really what the way you want to think about it, is that these fibers are the same ones that we saw in the previous tissue, but these cells are special because they add a unique cartilage special ingredient to that collagen, and it makes it much more firmer, and it's not so soft as it was before. And so that's how they can make a brand new different materials, that they just add something unique to collagen. It's kind of like they all cook with collagen, but they all add a different ingredient to make every single tissue different. And so a place that we find this is in the IV discs, or the intervertebral discs. Intervertebral discs. These discs are found, and what does this look like to us? What do we call the bones? The vertebra. And there's also a very special cavity in here. What is it called? Vertebral cavity. And is it a ventral or a dorsal cavity? A dorsal cavity. And what organ is inside? The spinal cord. Good, good. And so these discs allow for a cushion. This tissue serves in a few places where there's a lot of downward pressure. For example, these IV discs or the intervertebral discs. We also find it in the knee joints. This one's a little more popular. Like we can all imagine that our knees sort of are always like, there's one bone on top of the other bone. And so they serve as little pillows. That's the easiest way to think about this tissue, is that they serve as little pillows in a way, to cushion. And I'm going to put this in quotation, cushion. And pubic symphyses, don't worry about that. We don't know what that is yet. And so, again, cartilage is capable of providing some cushioning and some flexibility that, some of us, if we were like stretching our backs, we don't stay like that, right? We're not stuck like that, like a Gumby doll, right? We kind of like, we have to come back, right? It's meant to preserve the shape of our vertebral column, or it's meant to preserve its own shape. And so this is another picture of the same tissue. And this tissue tends to stain blue, which might be an easy test-taking technique for all of you, is that when you see blue, you're probably looking at fibrocartilage. And when you look at this, right, it's really hard to make out what you're looking at, but it's not until you train your eyes enough that when you learn where to zoom in, that you actually know what you're looking at. For example, if you look very closely, we can see our cells are, again, these cells that we're seeing here. But on the exam, you can expect that things will be asked up close like this. Up close like that. And so, last time, the cells inside are called chondrocytes, all packed with their own organelles, their own nuclei, and they're in a little cavity called a lacuna. They don't really have the luxury of swimming around or moving or going anywhere other than staying in this lacuna. All right. And another picture of the same type of tissue. But again, it always tends to stain blue. So that's kind of going to be a useful way to remember it. All right, let's keep it going. Now, there are only 3 cartilages, and I'm going to draw a nice little tree for you on the board in a second. And it will help you sort of just organize your thoughts around these things. But the good news is if you've understood me so far, you already learned out pretty much everything. Cartilage, what's the cell that's going to make cartilage? And they live in little cavities called? And congrats. So this other tissue called elastic tissue, it's the same information. But the only difference is if it's called elastic cartilage, what's the main fiber? Elastic, nice and easy. Tends to stain purple, right? All the hair-like fibers that we saw in the earlier one, I'm going to go ahead and just quickly skip back. You don't have to. Right here. When we were looking at this, the pink ones were collagen fibers, and these purple ones tend to be, these elastic fibers tend to stain purple, and so that's what we're seeing here on our elastic cartilage, is that it tends to stain purple. And we encounter this tissue on our ear. And again, our ear is the perfect example of why cartilage is so special for the body, is that it preserves shape, right? If you flick your ear, it doesn't stay like this, right? It goes right back into its original shape. And so it tends to be because this fiber is exactly like our elastic in the workout pants or workout clothes that we wear in our day-to-day lives, that elastic allows for stretchiness, and then when you take it off, right, it goes sort of gets all small again. And so it's the same concept with elastic cartilage. And otherwise, you know everything. That's it. Chondrocytes in little cavities called lacuna. What makes elastic cartilage special is that it has elastic fibers. Yes, and that's really it. Nothing else to add. Yeah, really nothing else to add. And so for the summer, as I'm going through this and functions, don't worry about function questions. I'm not going to ask you, what is the function of this tissue? Not in the lab exam. For the lecture exam, yeah. But for the lab exam, you do not need to know the functions. You just need to know a location, and you just need to know the little properties that we sort of have you list. I list on these flashcards for each one of these, just like that. And since there's no function here, let's remove it out. I don't want you stressing over the function. And knowing the location is the function. That's the fun thing about anatomy, is that we don't need to get too much into function. Just where things are is kind of just as good, at least in the very beginning. All right. And then lastly, you know everything about this tissue other than the name probably, hyaline cartilage. Otherwise, there's nothing else to add. We have chondrocytes, and they live in little cavities called lacuna. And so this cell, again, lives in these little cavities called lacuna. Nothing has changed. And their matrix, it's made out of something you already know. It's pink. What's probably the fiber, the main fiber? Collagen. Nice and easy. And you kind of already know the location for this. We learned about the abdominal regions, right? Our tic-tac-toe board. Oops, sorry. Tic-tac-toe board. When we were learning about the abdominal regions, what was the region up top? Hypochondriac, right? It meant below the cartilages, and that's because we have this unique cartilage called hyaline cartilage, and it is found here in the rib cage. In the rib cage, all of this. And so that's a location for it, the ribs. You can just write the ribs for our exam. More appropriately, they tend to be called costal cartilages, but we'll care more about that technicality when we get to the bone exam. For now, ribs is okay. We also find it in our nose, right? The cartilage of our nose. We find it in our windpipe. That's what the trachea is. And so any one of these that you can remember best, you only need to know one for our exam. So just pick one, and then you can use that one for your exam. All right. And that's pretty much it. There are 3 cartilages, and they all are all made by chondrocytes. Cartilage is special because they all have lacuna, and then they all pretty much just secrete collagen. The only one that doesn't really secrete collagen is probably which one? Elastic. And I believe this is our last tissue. And this one you already know, bone. And a lot of these properties you're already going to sort of understand. So where do we find bone connective tissue? Pretty easy, right? In the bones. You're just looking at a bone, the whole bone for now. Nice and easy. And the Latin root for word is osteo. Osteo. Osteo will always imply the bone in Latin. Will always imply the bone in Latin. And so there's osteocytes, and there will be in lecture next week after this first exam, osteoblasts. There will be blasts. That's why I really want you to get used to the word cytes and blast. I used to only make people learn what's on these cards, but I realize it's more productive to get blasts and cytes in your brain as early as possible. And so right now we don't care about the difference, but you can call it either an osteoblast or an osteocyte. And with that, the good news is that they get trapped in little cavities too, and those cavities share the name with cartilage, lacuna. Nice and easy. And then the main fiber that they produce, actually let's make sense of this image because there's a lot going on in here, right? What are we looking at? When we look at these little eyelashes in a way, or like these little dark commas, I really don't know how to describe it any other way, these dark little spidery looking structures, every single one of them is a lacuna with an osteocyte inside, and they're stuck in there. And so in their matrix, they produced collagen to the outside. They produced all this, what is that, like a yellow-brown, this yellow-brown material? This is nothing but collagen. It's just collagen. The only difference is that bone cells, or osteocytes, they're special because when they grab collagen, they add a special ingredient, which is, for now, bone salt, a bone ingredient. And then they turn collagen into what you know as bone. And so now if you just put everything into context and just think about a chicken bone again, can you guys tell I'm hungry? But anyways, when you think about the chicken bone, like you have the bone, right? The hard part that the meat is around it. And then you have that cartilage, right? That nasty little yellow part. Those two things, the bone and that nasty little yellow cartilage part, they're made out of collagen. The only difference is that these cells add, again, special bone ingredient, and it turns into what you know as bone, nice and solid. And then those cartilage cells, they add cartilage special ingredient, and it keeps it solid, but not so rigid like bone. And so you can see that the only difference really is just one little extra ingredient that these cells add. But otherwise, these cells, just by learning the generalities of a cell, you've learned a lot. All these cells have a nuclei. They all have an endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth. They all have lysosomes, peroxisomes, Golgi apparatuses. They all have plasma membranes. They all use DNA, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids to just carry out their functions. And so it feels overwhelming at first, but when you really put it into context, you've learned a lot. And just by keeping things very general and simple. And so for location, you can write anywhere in the body. for bones found in the bones. And do I want to get this detailed right now? I'm not going to test you on anything from this slide, but I just and I don't care about the words. There's a lot of text here. I just want you to just focus on the story here. Is that if you look at any one of these bones that you're seeing, and if you were to actually make a sagittal section, meaning that I was supposed to I would make one sagittal line, and then I open it, right? And I can see inside of that bone, it would look like this. So this is a sagittal section of a bone, and a lot of us may have grown up thinking that our bones are like just this, like a dead material that's just a consistent little, really don't know how to describe this, made out of, like a pillar, right? Like a dead material, right? Because we all seen, like in cartoons, movies, or some sort of hunting, that when you see a dead creature that's been dead forever, eventually it's just all you see is the bone. But when you look at the surface, it looks like it's solid throughout the entire bone. But when you actually open it up, you'll see that there's this space inside. And it's really a very loose space. It sort of looks like this, kind of spongy in a way, spongy like this. And the outside encasement, this outer, 10%. Let me connect mine. There we go. And so when you look at the outside of bone, it's actually going to look just like this, the outside. So it's like the outside, the entire encasement of bone is made of something we call compact bone. And so if we look at a cartoon image of just compact bone, the outer encasement, it looks like this. And so you're going to see this word again, osteo, osteonic, periosteum, right? Because osteo tends to be the word for bone. And so when we were looking at this image, we were looking at the outer encasement of bone, this whole segment. And so this is what we're seeing, these cylinders. And you'll notice that there's this dark circle, or these dark circles in the previous photo. And these are these same dark circles that we're seeing there. And so blood vessels and nerves run along the entire length through those canals, just like this. So the entire length of bone has blood vessels and nerves that go all the way down on the edges. Because again, if we're looking at this, they go along the edges. Nerves go down. So you can see why why bone is considered a connective tissue, because it even allows for a site for blood vessels to travel throughout the body. So it's also a connective tissue. And also, what's flowing through these red and blue ones in here? What connective tissue is flowing in there? Blood. And blood is also a connective tissue. Anything else? And again, you do not need to know anything specific from here. Just focus on the previous material, what you need to know. And here's a nice little cartoon image of an osteocyte, and inside of its lacuna, the cavity. And one last thing, sort of fun note to add is, just because bone, like when you look at bone itself, it's again not a dead material. It is a living thing that even when your body needs calcium, it actually takes it out of this. And when I said that bone special ingredient, it's actually calcium. Remember that I said that one of the unique things about the skeletal system, is that it's a major storage site for calcium. That special ingredient for bone is calcium based. And so that's when your body wants some calcium, there are other cells called osteoclasts which come in, and then they just chip away at the actual material itself, which is collagen and a calcium material, and then your body will be able to use that calcium when it needs it. And so it's a living, breathing little structure. Again, it's not a dead material as you might have thought when you thought about a dead animal and all that's left is the skeleton. All that's left is the dead material, the inorganic part, the calcium part. All the osteocytes are dead inside of a skeleton that's just been, sitting out in the wild for years or months. But otherwise, it's the osteocytes that keep it a living thing in a way. And again, one unique fact is that they are not capable of actual movement. And so they have these little canals where they passage materials to each other from one cell to another. And they're going to be conveniently called caniculi. And it's sort of like saying small canals. And I'm not going to test you on any of this that I just mentioned. It's just a nice little preview of what we're going to get into the second we finish our first exam. And sort of nice to just wrap our heads around this as we're learning about bone tissue. And so, nothing else to add. Nothing else to add. Just different pictures, more of the same thing. Don't forget, osteocytes in lacuna. That's all we need to know today. And they'll test you on caniculi, but I will not on the exam. I'm just kind of nice to, you're going to need to know it for the next exam, so you might as well just kind of learn these terms. You will not need to learn lamellae as well for our first exam, and those will be for our next exam, so do not worry when we get into bone. All right, congrats. You've learned all your tissues, not really much more to add. And so let me stop the recording.